Good morning. I am Dr. Mohammad Rafi, Associate Professor, Department of Cyber Security at Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today I want to discuss about the network programming and management subject, in which the topic is Introduction to Socket Programming. Introduction to Socket the programming. A socket is a one endpoint of a two-way communication link between two programs running which on a network. That network is a same the network. These are the two endpoints are running and communicating. A socket is a created at each end of the communication devices. By creating this the socket, the communication can be established from one device to the another the device in a same network, which is connecting to the network. Same network will be connected. Each socket has a specific address, which is composed of an IP address and a port number. Here it is a host X web server. So this is the address, IP address of the host. So the IP address is 146.86.520. So which IP address? This is the client IP address. Now which is composing the port number also. So this is a port number which is composing of the IP address, that is a 146.38.520, and which is composed along with port number also. IP address and port number both will be composed at server side and client side also. By composing these the IP address and port number effectively establish the communication between client and server. Sockets are generally employed in the client server the communication or client server applications. The server creates a socket which attached it's to a network the port addressed, then waits for the client to contact it. The client creating a socket and then attempt to connect to the server the socket. When the connection is established, transfer of the data can be take place between the server and the client. For example, if you take two computers, so it is a computer 1 and it is a computer 2. So the computer has the number of other applications. So these are the computer. So this computer, whatever the computer has the number of the application, it will be considered as the client system. And this computer has the, so which is a considered computer 2, which will be considered as a server system. Now this application is requesting this one of the application which is requesting the data to server the machine. Here, whenever it is requesting the data from the server, immediately the server is waiting for his the request. After receiving his the request, immediately which is responding. The server is responding, and like this here now we can establish the communication between the server and the client by connecting the sockets. Sockets provide a communication mechanism between the two computers using the TCP. That means the transmission control the protocol. A transmission control protocol or internet the protocol. So that is in a network that is considered a standard for all internet operations, and TCP or transmission control protocol, internet IP protocol, internet protocol. So in a network, the communications are defined as a client server model. Here, the client initiating the communication first, while the server is waiting for incoming request by the listening to a specific port on the network. Here is the client server the communication. So it is the client is initiating the communication to the server. It is initiating to the communication to the server. Whenever it is initiating the communication to the server is waiting. The server is waiting for the client to request. Next, client sockets. Client socket is nothing but so this is a socket. It is responsible for initiating the communication. It does this by sending a connection request to the server socket that resides on the server machine. Server socket, the server socket as the name suggested resides on the server machines. It is responsible for listening to the incoming connection request from the client sockets. Both the client side and server side, while establishing the communication, now we have to create the socket at client side and server side. By creating the socket at client side and server side, now we can establish the communication. That means the effective communication can be established. Types of sockets. In a network, there are two primary types of sockets can be categorized, namely datagram sockets. It is also known as a connectionless socket, and stream socket, also known as a connection oriented socket. Datagram socket. Datagram socket here now can use the UDP protocol, user datagram protocol. Datagram sockets uses the user datagram protocol, that is UDP, for data transmission. They are connectionless because you don't need to establish and close a connection explicitly. Why? Because it is datagram sockets are the connectionless sockets. Instead, you simply send the datagrams wherever you wish to. Each datagram can be routed and received independently of others. Next, datagram sockets. Take the datagram sockets. Datagram sockets is used to create and receive the datagram other packets. It creates a datagram socket and binds up with a existing port number on a local host missions. Here, so it is the server. Now, in this the server, the datagram sockets which establish the communication, effective communication. Here is the server has a server side the socket, and so this client also which has a one client side the socket. So which is the binding the request now, which is contacting, which is holding this the contacting the information for effective the transmission between the client and server. Here, which this is a connecting. This is the client the mission now which establish the connecting. Once if it is requesting the connection, the server now wait for the connection connection from the client. And once if it is a connection is established, now which is reading writing operations other can be performing. That means here the client sending the data, transmitting the data to the server. Data is requesting. So it is the server is waiting for the data, whatever the data is coming from the client. So for receiving purpose now, the server is waiting. And so this is a loop performing the after receiving, now which is after performing the read, write the operation here, now responding to the client. Data transmission can be done. So it is a looping form. That means continuously now which is a looping. After completing the task, now closing the connection. Once if the task is completed, the datagram sockets are connected at the server side and client side. Stream socket. Second type of the socket is in a communication is a stream socket. That is, in a stream socket we can implement the TCP protocol. This is a protocol. We can frame the protocol with a set of rules and regulations. Stream sockets use the transmission control protocol for data transmission. They are connected oriented, which means they have dedicated the connection between the client and the server and offer the reliable data the transmission. So this is a connection oriented diagram. Here is the server and client. Both are connected and establish the communication by using the TCP protocol, transmission control the protocol now which is established. Now which is first both side will establish the connection. Socket connection can be established and blind operation can be performed at the server side. Once if the blind operation is performed, now which is connected here. So once if it is connected, now which is the server is listening. Server is listening for data the transmission, so which is the coming from the client. So if it is connected, if it is accept the connection, once if it is accept, the server mission accept the connection immediately, which perform the reading and writing the operation and transform the data to client. Once the communication effective, the communication is established, the completed, so close the data transmission link. Connection oriented link can be closed after completion of the transaction. Here in a network, the network programming, a socket can exist in a various other states, which depend on whether the socket is a part of the server or the client, and specific of the data transmission protocol being used. First, we have to understanding the states are used for troubleshooting the network, the programming and creating effective networking application. Socket states. Datagram socket, if you take the datagram of the socket which has the number of the states, by considering the number of the states which is establish the connection to server. Here this is the socket, so which has the number of the states. One is a opened, that is a writable. Opened state means it is a writable, and bind the connect the operations can be transmitted to the named state. It is also writable, and close it. There is a closed set. So closed the function the call. Now it is all the function calls. Now from one state to another state, now we can use the function calls. By using this the function calls, we can perform the operations. That is here when the closest function call is calling, immediately the connection will be closed at server side or client side. Here data are arrived. Data is arrived. Named here once if it is a writable, the data is arrived and it is a readable. Data arrived is readable at data read and send the failed. Otherwise here the sending is failed, not readable. If the data sending is failed from client to server or server to the client, here that means here not writable. The output to the buffer is available. So in output buffer, whatever the not writable the data is available, that can be stored in a output the buffer. Whatever the data is available, readable, writable, so that can be stored in a input buffer. If it is stored in an input buffer, whatever buffer can in an input buffer, we can store the data by using FIFO mechanism. Here the FIFO mechanism, so which is the first, the FIFO mechanism. Now if we take the FIFO or the mechanism, first in first out. So the data can be stored in a first in first out or the mechanism in a input or the buffer. Whatever the data is received for the server, whatever the data is received from the client, so that can be stored in a the queue. So this is the queue, first in the first out. Now we can store the data in by using the FIFO mechanism, first in first out mechanism. Whatever the data is stored in a queue first, that can be retrieved, that can be deleted first. So here these are the datagram of the socket states. Now if you see open-ended socket, here the socket is open-ended, that means open-ended the state, that means here the socket returns unnamed socket, and unnamed socket is one that is not bound to a local address and a port number. Each and every host has a local address and port number. Based on the local address and port number, effectively transmit the data from client to server and server to client. The socket can be named explicitly with bind or implicitly with send to or connect to function calls. Named is a one that is bound to a local address and a port. The socket can now send or receive the data. So that is a named. Once the socket is named, so the data reading and writing operations can be performed. Readable. A network system receives the data and is ready to be read by the applications using receive function call and receive from function call. Not writable. The network system does not have enough buffers to accommodate the outgoing data. That is a not writable socket state. Closed. The socket handle is invalid. That means once the communication, effective communication is completed between the server and client. Now these closed socket the states can be utilized. The socket handles is invalidate. Socket function calls. The socket function calls. Now if you see socket, to creating a socket and bind function call, it's a socket identification like a telephone number to contacting. So which is binding both the IP address and port number at a server side and receiver side. That means server side and client side, both the sender side and receiver side. Listen. Ready to receive a connection. This is the function. Whenever this is the function is activating, now which is the meaning is which is ready to receive a connection. And connect means here ready to act a sender. And accept means here the confirmation it is accepting to receive call from a sender. Write means here now which is the performing the sending. That means here performing the write operation to send the data. That means to send the data from client to server or sending the data server to client. Read operation means here to receive the data. For example, if the server send the data, the client receives the data, and if the client send the data, the server receives the data by using this read operation. And write operation. So write the operation means here now which is just sending the data at a server side and receiver side. close operation. Close function call operation, which is to closing a connections at a server side and at a client side. Both the side, once if it is activated, the state is activated, immediately the communication will be stopped between the server and client. Socket programming. Socket programming is a way of connecting two nodes on a network to communicating with each other. One socket node is listens on a particular port at an IP address, while the other socket reaches out to form a connection. The server forms the listener's socket, while the client reaches out the server. The socket programming is a communication connection points, that is end points at a server side and a client side, that you can name and address in a networking. The networking should be same networking, so not a different networking. Same networking can be utilized in a socket programming. Socket programming shows how to use the socket application program interfaces, that is API, to establish the communication link between the remote and the local process. The sockets are usually generally we can it is both the side. Now we can use sockets are useful for both standalone and network application. That means now we can use standalone applications or any networking the applications now we can use. So networking applications in Ethernet or LAN, WAN, MAN, any networking applications now we can use the sockets or standalone other applications now we can use. That is a Uber cab booking or Ola cab booking. So any here this is a standalone application now we can use the sockets. Sockets allow you to exchanging the information between process and the same mission or across a network. Distribute the work to the most efficient missions. They easily allow access to the centralized data from central system. Socket programming is refers to process of creating applications that communicate over a network using the socket API, application program interface. Several programming languages, which including Python, Java, C++, C hash, offer the support for socket programming. Here, the socket programming can be implemented in a C++, C hash, Java, Python programming languages. Generally, these steps which is involved in a socket programming are created the socket, binding it to a specific address and a port, listening to incoming connections, accepting a connections, sending and receiving the data, finally closing the socket after effective communication is established between client and server. That means between two systems, client system and server system. There is in a socket programming, there is one-to-one communication as in a web socket, web browser. Take the web browser in a socket programming. Now we can use the one-to-one communications. It allows broadcasting to multiple nodes. Primarily, it uses a web sockets, but it can also be fallback to other methods like WebSocket, Flash socket, HTML file, XHR, the polling, and Ajax long polling, JSON P polling. The multiple clients sending the connection request and server accept the request by creating the new sockets for each with its local address and port. The socket can make the connection and send and receives the data from the sockets. Here you can see the socket, the programming clients, the multi-socket programming here. That means here multiple sockets can be created at a client. These are all the client side. At client side, multiple sockets can be created. So at one-to-one communication here, WebSocket. Now if you take WebSocket here, now one-to-one communication can be established. So here, with the help of the IP address or the port number, now which is sending the request to server. The server is waiting for the request coming from the client. Once the request is coming, once if it is the connection is established, the connection is accepted by the server. Here the data can be sent, so it can be receive the data and store the data in a server. Here server, the database, now it can be stored. So any organization, college organization, universities organization, so any organization here, the data, so from the multiple client, that is a cloud computing. This is a cloud computing. So multiple from the multiple clients, the data can be stored. That multiple from multiple clients, the data can be received and stored in a server machine. Whenever now, if you want to visualize now, utilize, that can be utilized now. We can see the data and at a server system. Here, next, the examples of here socket programming. Some examples of how socket programming is being used in the application development. That is web browser. Web browser use the socket programming to communicate with the web server. This allows web browser to requesting the web pages and other resources from the server. So this is a web browser. Email clients. Email clients use socket programming to send and receive the emails. This allows emails client to connecting to the email server and send and receiving emails over the internet. That is a email client. File sharing programming. File sharing programming. File sharing programming use socket programming to share files between the computers. This allow file sharing programs to connect to other computers and shares the file over the internet. Here this is a sample socket, the programming. By using the sample socket, the programming, now we can create the communication between the client and the server. Here this code now we can create this code by using this code. S is equals to socket AF IARE socket dot sock stream. So by using these the code, now we can create the socket at the client the side or at the server side, and binding the socket to a particular port. That means here IP address now, which is binding the IP address along with the port number. 5000 is a port number, that is a S dot bind local host, so which is binding this the port number is bind with the IP address. Once the binding is completed, the listen for the connection. The server listen for the connection. So S dot listen. So by default 1. That means here the client is only the single client, which indicates one client. That's from the single client now, which is listened only from one client. Suppose the server is listened 2 clients, now you can write it as 2. S dot listen 2. Suppose if it is server listened 3 clients, now you can write it as S dot listen 3. From 3 client now at a time, now it is establish the communication, receive the data from the clients whatever which required and store, and corresponding that now which is responding to the client. And here accept the connection. Accept the connection means connect ADD, or that is S dot accept function now which is accept. Once if it is accept, receiving the data from the client, sending the data back to the client. After receiving the data from client and sending back data to the client, that is closing the connection. Once the completion, data sending is the completion is completed. Data sending is the completed immediately. So which close the connection. The program first creates a socket object and binds it to a port. Then the program listens for the connection. When a connection is received, the program receives the data from the client and sends the data back to the client. Finally, the program closes the connection. So this is about the socket, the programming, the help of this the socket, the programming, creating a simple chart between client and server. Here is a simple sign client server diagrammatical representation for the server and client model the communication here. Here is server side will create the one socket, client side we can create the another socket. Once the server mission which is binding the operation, binding operation is the completed, so immediately here that means with the help of this the port number, that is the client address and port number here which establish the connection and listening the connection. If it is once listen the connection, successfully listen, accept the connection, and these are the connection here which is once if it is accepted, the client sending the data to the server, and here once if it is accepted, reading writing operations can be performed. Here reading operation means here whatever the data is sent by the client now which is received. Writing operation means after receiving and responding, that is sending the data to the client. Once the communication type is completed, now immediately the sockets can be disconnected at server side and client side. So these are state diagram of client and server model of the socket. So here is the stages for server. Socket creation, socket set socket opt, that is a set socket option, bind up, bind, listen, accept. Stages for server are socket creation, set socket option, bind, listen, accept. So these are all the stages for a server. And socket creation. First state is a socket creation. Generally, we can create the socket at the server side and client side by using this function. This is a code int socket fd, that is equals to socket domain type protocol. So this is a code Python that is implemented in a Python programming language. Here domain name, type and protocol. Socket, yes, socket fd, sock fd. Sock fd is nothing but a socket descriptor, file descriptor. FD means file descriptor, socket file descriptor, and integer like a file handle. Domain integer specifies the communication domains. We will use address the family AF address family of local as defined in the POIX, that is portable operating system interface. Portable operating system interface standard for the communication between process and the same host. For communicating between the process on a different host which are connected by IPv4, we use AF address the family INET internet and address family INET 6. That means INET 4, INET 6 for the process connected by the IPv4. Here is we'll use INET address family INET 4 connected by IPv4 Internet Protocol version 4 and address family INET 6 for the process which will be connected by the IPv6. And you see socket the creation. The socket the creation, in socket creation type is not what which type of the communication we are using between the client and server. What type of the communication we are using, whether it is a connection oriented communication or connection less communication. SOC stream. So it is a TCP in a SOC stream. Now we can use the transmission control protocol. So by using the TCP transmission control protocol, that can be implemented. That is a reliable transmission control protocol is a reliable. It is a connection oriented protocol. SOC stream, that is a TCP, it is a reliable, it is a connection oriented protocol. SOC datagram, dgram means datagram. Here this SOC dgram, it can be implemented by using the UDP protocol, user datagram protocol, now which is unreliable and connectionless. So these are the protocol values for the internet protocol, which is 0. This is the same number that appears on the protocol field in the IP address of the packet. Socket option, that is set socket option. These help in manipulating the options for the socket, which is defined by the file descriptor SOCFT. SOC file descriptor. This is completely optional, but it helps in a reusing of the address and port, preventing errors such as address already in use. So the code for this setting the socket option is int set sock op int sock fd, that is a socket file descriptor, int level, int optional name, construct void opt value, optional value, which is a pointer type, which is refers the address of the communicating data, whatever the data we are communicating, which refers the that value the data. Sock length, opt length, that means which refers the socket length, or whatever the sockets now we are using at client side and server side, which refers the length of the socket. By using these the code, now we can set the socket options for communication. Next, to bind int sock fd, construct sock address star address means pointer, sock length, address of the length. After the creation of the socket, the bind function binds the socket to the address and port specified in the address custom data structure, now which is binding both the address and port number. With the help of this address and port number, now we can establish the communication. In the example, we bind the server to the local host, hence we use IARE, that means address, anyway, to specify the IP address and port number. With this IP address and port number, the socket can be binded and establish the communication. With the help of this, the socket only, now the server and the client sending receiving operations can be performed. Without the socket here, which won't perform, the server and client won't perform the operations. Listen, fourth stage is a listen. Int socket fd, int backlog. Whenever the server is listen, immediately, so establishing the connection and performing the accept the functionality. See here, once the accept the functionality is performed, the data can be transferred from the client to the server. If it is not listen, we can't transfer the data from client to the server. Here the backlog defines the maximum length to which the queue of the pending connections for a socket file descriptor may grow. Here it puts the server socket in a passive mode, where it is wait for the client to approaching the server to make a connection. If a connection request is arrives, when the queue is full, the client may receive an error. Why? Because here first in first out. So it is implemented. Sockets are perform the operation based on the queue data structure. So it is implemented by using the queue. So once it is a queue is a full, the client may receive an error with an indication of the error connection refused. Error connection, whenever once it is receives the error, the client is receives the error from the server. That means here the server is a full. In a server at the client side, the queue, the socket, whatever the socket maintaining the queue is a full. So here immediately we send the E connection is refused. Due to this error, the connection is refused and accept. Once if it is refused, it won't accept the data packets from the clients. Once if it is accepted, now which is receives the data packets from the client into new socket, that is accept into socket FD, struct socket address ADDR, socket length and T, address length. So it extract the first connection request on the queue of the pending connections for the listening socket. Socket file descriptor creates a new connected sockets and returns a new file descriptors referring to the socket. At this point, the connection is established between the client and the server, and they are ready to transferring the data from client to server, server to client. Once accept state is activated, once if it is activated, we can transfer the data between client and server. Stages of the client. Socket connection. Client side only the connect stage is there. Once the socket is, the connection is active, exactly the same as the server socket the creation. Here also we can create the socket. Socket, the connect call, function call, that is a system call, connects the socket the transferred to by the descriptor socket FD to the address specified by the ADDR address. Server address and port is specified in ADDR. The code for this one is int connect int socket FD construct socket address, which is the pointer type, socket length that can be specified at the client side. Here is with this one, the client socket establish the connection to server. If it is establish the connection from client to the server, now the data can be transferred. Here some of the key features of the sockets are, it is a purely written in a JavaScript. Any language now we use Python, not only JavaScript, now we may write in a Python, C, C++, any the program. But here now we are writing JavaScripts on a client side, which runs in the browser on a server side. Now this JavaScript, whatever the JavaScript is implemented at the server side, so that can be written on a client other side. It is totally open source program, real-time exchanging the data between the server and the client. Support a lot of the browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Safari, IE. These are all the features. Third-party open source the platforms for Android, iOS, etc. Socket.io, which is the JavaScript library for a real-time web application. We can use for real-time web application has mainly two parts. That is a client and server. Client side run on a browser, server side run on a server. For that now we can store it as node.java, JS, that is JavaScript. And the applications, Sockets allow applications to communicate using the built-in mechanism of hardware and operating system. WhatsApp Messenger is also using the socket programming concept for free messaging or chatting. Many apps which are using it to sending and receiving the data from client and server like Gophers, Corrigar, Ola Cab, Uber. So these are all the real-time applications. Ola, Uber. Take the Uber concept is about the driver and user communication, like sending request for taxi. At another end, driver will accept or decline the request. Socket will use the fundamental technology of the computer network to enumerate. It allows the applications will communicating to develop both the operating system and also hardware. For example, Messenger and WhatsApp used to socket programming for chatting. So this is a real-time applications. Now take the socket, this brief, the summary of the socket. Socket play a pivot role in a network the communication and form a foundation of any client server communication model. They allow for structured and reliable data exchange between the different network nodes, making it the possible to create complex networking applications and the protocols. Protocols is nothing but a which is framed by using the set of rules and regulations. Understanding the sockets and their the functionalities can open the door to the dynamic world of network programming. Whether it is building a simple chart application or working with the complex distributed system, the understanding of how sockets work will be invaluable assets. Here, the learning the socket programming course is helping the professional for maintaining or else designing the networking. In the final analysis, the considerable services are Airtel. Now you can utilize Airtel, Reliance or high in the networking service providers in a SLA, which means service level agreement. SLA means service level agreement. It is developing the more knowledge in a cloud era certification, PHP website development courses. For the most part, best embedded the courses and so on.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.